Fairy Friend, a song for the ecology of belonging. Robin Artisson, July 15th, 2018. Introduction. Cysolatha. The lifeway of rural people who practiced some form of the ancient fairy faith in older times was a tapestry of many threads and designs. The influences of the fairy faith may have figured prominently in their lives, but in some places it operated at a level just below the surface of awareness. No pre modern rural lifeway from any of the cradle lands of the fairy faith could have lacked its influence. The people in question may simply not have openly recognized many of their social customs and spiritual ecological relationship tenets, particularly between themselves and the land, as artifacts of an older spirit saturated way of being. And yet, the sublime presence of the ancestral past was there, quietly permeating their cultural aesthetics and basic ways of looking upon the land and the world. Within the tapestry of their lives, many influences came to bear. Unwise influences drove them to behave at times in contradictory ways to the elder impulses that pressed upon them from other unseen directions. But their world was not yet ruined by the Industrial Revolution and the unprecedented dark times it would herald. There was a sort of equilibrium maintained between humans and the lands they inhabited, however much the ancient poetry underlining that equilibrium may have gone silent, and with it, the conscious veneration of the other than human inhabitants of the land. The old people, even under the regimes of Christian and feudal societies, inherited long standing subtle influences and relationships from the hidden world, which created a unique kind of psychic activity within them and became celebrated in their many endeavors. When the fairy faith dwelled very close to the surface in certain times and places, there could have been no doubt in the minds of the folk that it was a pre Christian intrusion of history and spiritual reality within their lives. The accounts we find in the writings of Catherine Briggs of the veneration of fairy beings in the English fens, based on the information given to a Miss Balfour from her fen man informant, spell out a blatant intrusion of elder spirit worship that included fires built on ancient stones, blood offerings, a focus on the spiritual authority of female members of the community, and a constant focus on the need to respect and satisfy the spirits of nature, else famine and want would descend on the community. They were openly aware that these things indwelled a dimension of preternatural activity that the church and their wider society would have disapproved of. These realities of life and the fairy faith among the secluded people of the fens are historical realities. They are accounts of the historical beliefs of a community and of historical events. They are not fantasies derived from a fanciful tale. They are not produced by the desires of some modern people to discover mystical survivals of paganism in some corner of England. They are accounts of historical reality from a first hand witness, an informant who lived these things and whose reliability as a source has never been called into doubt. There is a silent and unconscious cultural conspiracy to disbelieve such things could have happened or existed as late as the informant describes. Our culture's rooting in such animistic and primitive practices has been thoroughly erased from the minds of most people, and any place where it lifts its head will become cemented over with the usual barrage of doubt, disbelief, skepticism, and righteous scorn. Entire chapters of folk history from the last 17 centuries are progressively blotted out as Europeans and Americans and others approach the dawn of reason, just as surely as they were mangled by the earlier dawn of a new faith embodied by the church. There's an entire spiritual, ecological, cultural experience and language that is forbidden to us. There are approved ways of talking and thinking about the past and what must have happened between the time people went from pagan to Christian, and then from Christian to enlightened, and from enlightened to his factory workers. The story must be kept straight to justify every modern development of rootless identity, technocratic overreach, and isolation as positive destinations arising from a positive historical arc of evolution. If you were to see a respected scholar of history laughing about the man who was pulling Miss Balfour's leg, believing without any honest reason that his folk life testimony was all made up, understand that you would be seeing a deep defensive mechanism embedded in the psychology of modernity. The non-approved but very real history of the rural folk of the fens testifies to the chief's secret reason why they had such peace and richness in their lives. The unseen was close, and its influences filled their lives with an older, anchoring sense of respect for nature and the many living forces all around them. And it is precisely those things that are the arc of history leading away from the fen folk has started. These precious things were permitted to persist for centuries in a diminished form to cultural and personal consciousness, so long as God and a batch of saints stood consciously over them. They no longer had a hiding place after the factories began to belch poison into the air and machinery replacing man and horse. Before tractors tore into the land, the plowman's rough, worked hands may have given honey or cream to the furrows or to the blade of the plow. Even if he was a devout Christian, something deeper inside him stirred to thank the land in these ways or to encourage the fertility of the same. Even if he imagined that the distant God in heaven was ultimately in charge of the land's fertility, something vestigial motivated him to douse the tangible soil or plow blade with a libation. Something immediate before his eyes and between himself and the land had to happen to satisfy him on the deepest level. The persons of the indwelling powers of that land received what he did. In return, they imparted to him something wordless, his total lack of conscious awareness of them notwithstanding, something deeper in him. His free soul still gazed into the eyes of the others and reached out to them. The connection was honored and maintained. Many of the strands of rural life interlaced with the hidden enjoyments and relationships of the free souls of the people. Their breathing lives may have been hijacked by new cultural evolutions, but their dreaming lives continued on in a blissful fairyland, which now inhabited their favorite stories around the community fire. The kind of peace the folk had from the subtle yet dense and rich presence of such things is, I think, a special kind of peace. It is a peace of belonging, a peace sprung from still maintaining connection to the older spiritual ecological realities that preceded modern culture. The term I use for it is Cysolatha, means peace, tranquility, or concord in the old tongue. In my usage, it implies a deep emotional sense of belonging to community, to place, and to the seen and unseen aspects of the world as they interlace themselves with those things. And there is no Cysolatha without the unseen world, just as there is no living without a soul, no body without a soul. The human social world has been on a massive downward spiral for a very long time. Few men or women in any previous age could have noticed it. So wide is the downward arc, but the wounding and diminishing of the human world was sometimes intuited in earlier times. Certain prominent cultural stories may have drowned this natural intuition out, stopping it from being received with alarm. The Christian idea that the world is intrinsically sinful and inclining towards judgment is one example. The earlier notion that the world is fatefully and cyclically degenerating towards a destruction and rebirth point is another. In my mind, these stories are designed to give people license to ignore the damage they and their civilizations are actively causing the world and place it within a context of more or less helplessness. It is to the great benefit of the masters of historical civilizations that the people accept pain, suffering, and degeneracy as parts of a cosmic moral consequence or an inexorable, painful, fateful plan. Whatever is metaphysically true here is not the point. What matters is that people can be encouraged to ignore the ceaselessly growing sense of pain, emptiness, and disconnection the civilization's progress demands. Very early civilizations, and even the folk of the pre modern, pre industrial times that I have been speaking of thus far, were not above or beyond doing harm to the land and to the powers which indwell it. The agricultural revolution and the aeons long scourge of the cow and the plow transformed the world in vast and thoroughly damaging ways. And yet, before industrialism tipped humanity over the final ledge and into the wasteland of the Anthropocene era, there were still stages of, albeit greatly diminished, equilibrium to be had between humans and the world. And the people whose culture still had the active presence of fairyism or any of the many other deeply embedded cultural descendants of older animistic lifeways had some means to bring about reconciliation between themselves and the indwelling persons of the land and nature. They had ways of gaining what I call Cysolatha, which means to make friends, to reconcile. When the ancient fairy faith was finally shoved further into the unseen region of culture due to the destruction of the old rural lifeways, its timeless pathways to Cysolatha went with it. The restored vision of the fairy faith that I explicated in my book, On Carl Gwyn, has at its core the realization that the Cysolatha granting old ways can reemerge in various forms into our lives through the folk tales, folklore, and stories of our pre modern past. The chief carriers of the deep messages of the fairy faith in pre modern times were the stories of the old folk, after all. Important metaphysical clues and distant ancestral visions are still present within them, working alongside cousin efforts to restore spiritual ecological paradigms to other in other fields, an organic framework viable for the resurrection of certain old and vital strains of wisdom has become a reality. The inner animistic cosmos that lurks within and behind the surreal and wondrous landscape described by our fairy tales can be known again. It can be explored again, for it is the same world we've been living in since we were born, and in stranger ways, even before that. We can see the world with new eyes that borrow wisdom from older eyes. We don't need to return to the 16th century or even the 6th century. Ancestral insight is channeled, seemingly, forward in time to us through the fund of folkloric wisdom. In our search, we meet other beings, the other than human persons who stand within and behind the images of the fairy beings themselves. The relationships that our foreparents had with them can be renewed. In that renewal, the landforms and sensual phenomenon that some of them indwell in our world cease to be perceived as the mundane matter devoid of intelligence that we have been taught to see them as, and become to our awareness what they secretly always have been living, co creative partners in the ancient sensing and expressive interaction web of life. Within those revived and revitalized extraordinary relationships, the larger picture of our existence as human beings becomes clearer to us. Layers of blindness, denseness, and numb cynicism fall away as forgotten realms of kinship become known again. Following the intuitive and organic rules of relationship, bringing the timelessly appropriate stances of reciprocity, reverence, and respect back to the forefront, we find our true place in our larger family. And at last, we can be reconciled to those we have collectively harmed and those we have collectively forgotten. Cysolatha is possible again. And then a rare and genuine interpersonal peace in one's time and place can follow. When we live a life devoted to this reconciliation and building an ongoing respectful peace and friendship with the unseen, we naturally change our orientation towards our human world, hopefully becoming more patient and willing to help our fellow beings in their own struggles for peace, security, and belonging. We cease walking through the world blindly and carelessly. We walk softly and with more attention. We no longer resonate at a subtle level with the grim spirit of disconnection and selfish harmfulness that taint which the collective trauma of our modern civilization has bequeathed to us. The taint is not shaken off completely in a moment's time, but it is dimmed. It finally loses its iron grip, and over time, its power to make us feel isolated becomes less. In a word, we become justified, which is to say, seen by the invisible eyes of the unseen world as a friend of spirits, the fairy friend of folklore. The simple yet infinitely layered reality of relationship makes this possible. The moment the circle of a relationship is widened beyond the human world to include beings unseen, as well as the other than human beings who express themselves as animals, plants, and other phenomenon too. These extraordinary relationships are possible because they are ancestral to us, as much as our human foreparents are. We came from within this web of relationships and we belong here. This is the vision of what I call the ecology of belonging. It is also the essence of fairy traditionalism, as I believe it can exist in our modern day, in every moment of our modern lives, if we make the space for it and become the sorts of people willing and able to receive what it can unseal within us and between us and others. Many people who read these words will feel willing to open themselves to such a transformation or to such a new way of being. But how does one become able? If we could simply will it to happen, all would be well. But much is not well. We have deeply internalized, harmful, contrary stories from the social conditioning we received from the moment of our birth. We must dismantle those stories and neutralize their power on us to become able. The fairy tradition gives us good stories to replace them with, but room has to be made for these things. This process can be challenging and painful, and it can take a long time, but it can be accomplished. We belong in this world, and the primordial life way attached to the reality of being where one belongs is encoded at the core of each of us. We intuitively recall how to be in this world and relate to others the moment we get free of our socially ingrained bad assumptions. The mission of the Circle of the White Stag on Carl Gwen is to create a community of people who are sympathetic to the goal of rediscovering the primordial peace that is our human birthright and finding the special reconciliation with the many powers of our world that will restore it. The kilk is for people who feel that the ancient fairy faith is aesthetically appropriate for their needs in this regard. The beauty and power of spiritual aesthetics can never be underestimated. When we have a positive aesthetic commingling with a series of ideas or with a place or with a community, we gain the power to change, learn, and grow with great ease. Aesthetics that match how our souls feel make our souls feel safe and welcome and willing to partner for greater deeds and explorations. The fairy faith's timeless vision of the green land, of ancient monumental ruins which whisper with the voices of distant ancestors, of meetings with part human, part beast entities in wilderness places, of sitting before a glowing hearth on a winter's night and pouring out offerings of honey or cream to the spirits of that hearth or to one's ancestors to obtain dreams of advice from them. This awakens something in the heart of many men and women from many different backgrounds. It bestows bravery and a desire to belong to something different and something greater than perhaps we have ever known before. It makes people feel as though they have come home and they are on the road to the simple tranquility of Cysolatha. To help the men and women of the Kilk of the White Stag obtain this peace and the ultimate state of justification, a potent and simple expression of these values has been created, which can be embraced and used to circumscribe and guide one's understandings and actions. It comes in the form of a pledge, an oath that I have called the Oath of Belonging. This present work is intended to be an in depth analysis of that oath, to help those who have taken it to understand it better, and to help those who have not taken it, but perhaps will one day understand it better too. Before I head into my analysis of that oath, I must return briefly to the exploration of how people become able to succeed at the genuine realization of peace through it and through the countercultural metaphysical revolution that occurs when they choose to live the fairy faith in the modern day.